A man came up to me on the street and he said, "What's the quickest way to the pub?" And I said, "Are you walking or do you have a car?" And he said, "I have a car." And I said, "Good, that's the quickest way." Jokes. Okay, sorry for background noise today. They're building a new road outside my house. They've been building it for 4 years and they're doing such a bad job that this week the president had to get involved. Today we're talking about whether sobriety is really difficult or whether it's all just hype. Brothers, sisters, comrades and friends, welcome to Bad Country. Okay, so there's a thing that's on my mind. It's a thought that I've never ever been able to shake. For as long as I've been doing Bad Country and for as long as I've been sober and trying to get sober and all of that stuff, it's an automatic response I have to when people say, "Congratulations on your sobriety." And I say this all the time. If you're in the comments and you tell us all how long you've been sober, I will inevitably say congratulations on your sobriety or on your progress. But when people say it to me, I find it to be a double-edged sword. And my initial reaction, naturally, being a human being, is to be grateful that someone has said congratulations on your sobriety, or they're congratulating me for being sober, whatever. But then there's another little thought in the back of my admittedly mentally ill brain, which says, I'm not convinced this is a thing that's worth congratulating. I'm being congratulated basically for behaviour that should not be exceptional. It's kind of like the bare minimum, right? Being sober or beating alcoholism. There's a tiny little bit of me that thinks, well, what I'm doing is, all I did was stop doing something that I shouldn't have been doing anyway. And I've never been able to shake that off. As long as this goes on, and it doesn't matter who says it, that is almost an automatic response for me. And it is a problem, because it demeans how difficult sobriety was. When I have that thought, like, why do I deserve congratulations for not drinking? It was drinking that was the problem, right? I was the problem for a long time. So congratulating me for stopping, it's a bit like congratulating every driver for not crashing. That's kind of the point, you know? That's normal, that should be the expected behaviour. So I have that kind of, I can't stop that, that's a me thing, that is my stupid, weird brain, I know that. But every time it comes up, as it has done, it did this morning, it makes me wonder how much of sobriety is actually difficult and how much of it is people like me, like people who talk about sobriety, how much is in our interest to make it seem more difficult than it really is. So I thought I'd examine that with you today. I thought that I would talk about how hard sobriety really is or is not. And this is just a disordered video. I have the day off because it's Easter here. So I'm just going to talk and then see what emerges. I hope you'll come with me. So the first thing worth addressing is that there is a difference between sobriety and withdrawal, right? So in the early stages of quitting alcohol, you're sober, but that process is a different phase, in my opinion, from actual sobriety. And I hope that doesn't sound gatekeepy when I say actual sobriety. What I mean is that there is a period, the first few months of post-alcoholism, that is very different from the rest of long-term sobriety. It's almost incomparable, right? Because the first, let's say, an arbitrary number, let's say 3 months, all of that is just alcohol leaving your body, basically, and your brain starting to recalibrate and your central nervous system starting to adjust to the lack of the presence of alcohol. Those first few months, certainly the first few weeks, are more about just balance. They're about figuring out, no, not even figuring out, you're not in a figuring out stage at that point. It's more about like physiological processes. It's about your body starting to regenerate certain processes that had become destabilized in the process of alcohol. And I would say, I think it's almost objective that the withdrawal process, the first few weeks, first few months of sobriety are objectively hard. They're harder depending on how long and how intensively you were drinking and how terrible your withdrawal was and whether it progressed to hallucinosis and delirium tremens and that kind of thing. But it's horrible for everybody. Even if you dodge the worst of it, it's still awful. So that, I think, I'm safe to say, feel free to argue with me in the comments, the first few weeks are terrible and hard and difficult by any standard. That's the period in which your compulsion to drink is the most adamant. That's when your addiction is just trying every moment of every day to trick you back into drinking. And you have to be really fleet-footed. You have to be really on your game in order to survive that process, especially if you're doing it kind of raw and unmedicated. So I'm going to leave that aside because I don't think many people would argue that withdrawal from alcohol is fucking hard. It goes almost without saying. I want to talk more about sobriety in its longer term, in its broader sense, about what is hard and what isn't, and what's overblown. I'll tell you why, right? I'll just get this out of the way, because I was going to build up to this point and do a nice YouTube video with this kind of punchy ending, but fuck that. I'm just going to tell you why it's on my mind, right? Now, it's possible to look at people in recovery who talk openly about their drinking. People like me, people like other sober podcasters and YouTubers, but also kind of the big voices in AA and other sobriety rooms. People with opinions, basically, who talk openly about their drinking. It's easy to point at them and point at us, me, and say, you are romanticizing alcohol. Every moment, every time you talk about it, you're romanticizing your relationship with alcohol. And I straight up think that's bullshit. There isn't very little romantic about my relationship with alcohol. And if you find some of the things I've said previously about the experiences I had as a result of alcohol, if you find that romantic, that's your projection. I think it was scummy and disgusting. Look, I once shit myself in a psych ward because I contracted a norovirus while I was going through withdrawal. I shit myself on the floor of a psych ward. That sums up my drinking. If you think it's romantic, then that's on you. What I think I am more guilty of, and people like me, is romanticizing the struggle of sobriety. Right? This is particularly true of like Instagram and TikTok sober people, but it's also true of old-fashioned long-form people like me as well, where it's kind of, we have a vested interest to romanticize the struggle of sobriety in order to justify continuing to talk about it all the time. There is a kind of cultural incentive in making sobriety seem like an infinite puzzle that can never be fully solved, and a thing that will continue all your life, that you are permanently in a fight for sobriety, you are permanently in recovery. And there's some good reasons for that. For example, shared stories are good for kind of community cohesion. It's good to, when you're in early sobriety, it's good to be able to find a tribe, find your community of people. And the only way to do that is to find people with similar experiences and similar stories. So that's the kind of benevolent side of romanticizing the struggle of sobriety. There is also a more cynical side, which is, it kind of creates a narrative tension, right? People look at us talking about our experiences of sobriety, and there's always this kind of tempting will they, won't they relapse kind of thing going on. The harder we make it seem, the higher the stakes are. So it's in our interest, in order for simple things like YouTube analytics and Instagram and TikTok revenue, it's in people's interest to make it seem like a constant fight. And the longer I go into it, the less I feel like it is. Because sobriety over time, in the last, 2 and a bit years or whatever, it really genuinely has got much easier, to the point where it's no longer the front of my mind at every given second of every day, like it was in the first 3 months or 6 months or so. It's no longer a constant. My shields are always up, right? I'm always vigilant about alcohol. But I'm also not thinking about it all the time anymore. It doesn't possess all of my cognitive bandwidth in the way that it definitely did in the early days. And that can only be because it's getting easier, right? That can be the only reason for it kind of becoming a permanent back of mind thought rather than a permanent front of mind thought. And that's a good thing, but people like me can use it cynically. It's in our interest to say, I had a temptation today, and then watch the numbers go up because people are curious about that kind of thing. In a sense, what we're doing, like I said, I reject the argument that people who talk about their recovery romanticize alcohol. That's not true. Usually not true. But there is something inarguable, indefensible about the point that we are romanticizing the struggle. So let's take a quick look at it. How hard, how difficult actually is sobriety? I think, well, you'll have to forgive me, but to answer this kind of question, I have to talk in really abstract terms. It's just the way that my brain organizes information. And I think I would make the argument that the sobriety thing depends on a definition, right? So for a lot of people, including me to an extent, sobriety is easy enough to measure just by, it can be defined by not drinking the thing. That is enough. If you never drink again, I think it's safe to call yourself sober, right? Because you're never going to be drunk. And that is a real fundamental definition. You've got to stop putting it in your mouth. You have to stop drinking the shit, right? And that's good enough for a lot of purposes. And then there's arguments about emotional sobriety and whether all of this stuff should be under the umbrella of sobriety. And I find that to be an example of how we make it seem harder make sobriety seem more difficult than it really is. That is also an element of romanticizing the struggle, right? Of saying that, yeah, sure, you haven't had a drink for 20 years, but were you emotionally sober? I kind of find that a bit icky, a little bit gross. It's true. It is a true point. It is very valid. It's a valid argument, but it's still unfair. Or at least it doesn't sit right for me. And the reason I mention that is because if you measure sobriety just by the fact that you no longer consume alcohol, you no longer put the alcohol in your body, then that's easy. That's an easy metric, and it's also easy to do. It's easier to not put the thing in your body than it is to be an alcoholic, right? It's easier in some senses to be sober than it is to be an alcoholic. The hard thing about sobriety is that realistically, in practice, it goes way beyond whether or not you're actually drinking alcohol. And the hardest point for most people is the identity change that comes with sobriety. For a lot of us, the friction of sobriety comes from losing the drinker identity, right? And rebuilding a new identity in sobriety. Rebuilding all of your routines and your schedules and your structures without alcohol as a reward. Taking part in social events without alcohol. Social recalibration. In other words, sobriety feels hard because it forces a kind of psychological restructuring, a relearning of who you are. It's not because abstaining is complicated. It's not. It's simpler than drinking. But what's difficult is the fact that you have to wrestle with reconciling who you used to be, the way you used to think of yourself as a drinker, with how you are going to continue thinking of yourself in sobriety. That is incredibly hard. For me, drinking was such a big part of my identity that I was forced to quit, right? And the reason I was forced to quit is because I had a million opportunities before it nearly killed me, at which I could have walked away from it. The thing is, every single time I met one of those minor hurdles and I was like, okay, it's time to stop, it forced me to imagine my entire life without alcohol and what that would mean for me and my relationship with, with like socializing and sex and dating and being popular and being cool and all of that stuff. And I was scared of losing so much of that stuff that it just kept me drinking. And that is a real difficulty of sobriety. And I still, as much as I just said, I'm wary of romanticizing the struggle. Of all the struggles there are in sobriety, I still worry about that one. About when I meet new people. I started a new job recently. And they're all kind of normal, most of them are kind of normal, healthy drinkers. And have already been asking me to go down the pub. And I have to say, no, I don't want to go and be in that environment. And I've had to learn to be okay with kind of being a boring, grumpy old man, rather than the kind of frivolous and reckless and spontaneous man I was when I was younger. I had to let go of that identity. And part of me, frankly, misses that, of the kind of recklessness that alcohol can afford. I had to become a different person. I had to become an entirely different person for the sobriety to stick. And in that sense, yeah, sobriety is fucking hard. So that's the kind of abstract way of thinking about the difficulty of sobriety, is in relating it to something really conceptual like identity. Who you are, or who you think you are, is more important. The good news is that sobriety is made easier because most of us, if you're watching this, right, and you're watching it because you are a drinker, there's a good chance you're drinking because you're hiding from something, right? It's either negative emotions or it's a discomfort with the way that you see yourself. And all of that goes away in sobriety, and you're left with your actual, real, underlying personality in the end. And that's usually better. It's much better for your mental health because you don't have so many conflicts. You're not kind of pulling at different tensions all the time, right? So how difficult is sobriety chemically? Like, how difficult is the dependence? The actual physical, chemical dependence on alcohol. Well, I would argue that as disgustingly, life-threateningly bad as the withdrawal period is, the actual chemical dependency is not quite as severe as it's made out to be. And the reason why I say that is because many, many millions of people get sober and stay sober every year. And I know there's conflicting data from groups like AA, for example, that relapses happen to like 96% of people, or whatever that number is. But chemically, if sobriety itself were inherently difficult in a sustained day-to-day sense, then relapse would be 100%, right? But it's not that way. There are millions of people who maintain sobriety quite comfortably every year. And what that suggests is that the difficulty curve of sobriety is front-loaded. That is, it's much harder at the beginning. And it gets progressively easier after that. Even though, you can relapse after 20 years or 30 or something. It can catch us all out at some point. But the fact that people do maintain sobriety indicates that, yeah, it's a tough fight, but it is at least possible. And the rates of getting out of alcohol, I suspect, are probably better than the kind of people who say that statistic about AA, that only 96% of people 96% of people will never get sober for long term or permanently. It tends to be quoted by people who have an agenda against AA, doesn't it? And your own personal environment is also really important for how much difficulty you're going to have with sobriety, right? Because there are certain environments in which sobriety is much more difficult. So if you work in the music industry, or if you work in the service industry, or if you are in the military, for example, all of these places have alcohol baked into the culture. And they center alcohol as part of the normal daily process, and offer the alcohol as an escapist reward. Any high-pressure job will also do the same. It will have you looking forward to a bottle of wine after work, or a beer in the pub or something. And those kind of structures, high-pressure, high-stress, creative industries too, and catering, all of these make it harder to be sober. So what is it that's causing the difficulty? Why is getting sober if you work in a bar harder than getting sober if you work, for example, as a postman? Well, if you're a postman, you're getting up at 5 o'clock in the morning and doing your rounds, which means that you have to be getting up at that time, otherwise you have no job. But in a bar, you're surrounded by people who are drinking, whose attitudes are positive about drinking, and you have access to it all around you. The same in the music industry. If you're a musician, you're quite often surrounded by emotionally vulnerable, creative people, or you might be one yourself, who requires the emotion deadening effect of alcohol to get through your day, or you feel like you need it as part of your creative process, or blah blah blah, a million other reasons. So it's more difficult depending on your own circumstances. For me, when sobriety first stuck for me, it was actually in the very early part of the pandemic. So I had this, forever, as terrible as the pandemic was, for me, I was in lockdown. I was locked in a house. All the pubs were closed, all the shops, were difficult to get to. I was in a remote part of England. And that was a great leg up for me. The opportunity wasn't there for me. And not everybody has that same structure, unless you're willing to go to rehab or detox centres. And I know that that's not easy for a lot of people, especially if you're in the US. And this is an important one, which perhaps I shouldn't leave at the end of the video. And now this one is important. If you've watched this far, this is your reward. This is my daily controversial, powerful opinion. People who say that it's hard, people who repeatedly talk about how difficult sobriety is, often say that because they have unresolved problems, aside from the alcoholism, right? Aside from the sobriety itself. People who are obsessed with the difficulty of long-term sobriety, who are always claiming that it is a daily struggle. The reason it's a daily struggle is because they're usually struggling with something underneath, some psychological driver that was initially driving their drinking in the first place. But now the drink is gone, they still haven't addressed that underlying psychological driver, whatever it is, depression or trauma, something. There's something underneath that is making it still difficult for them, and they haven't realised it yet. So, in my opinion, if someone is still it's like 3-5 years sober, but is still describing sobriety as a daily battle, then one of two things is happening. One is either they are an Instagram influencer is in their interest to make sobriety seem more difficult than it really is, or two, they have not yet really done the work, the underlying work that is necessary for long-term sobriety. That is, they haven't sought professional treatment, or they haven't resolved the underlying psychological problems that were causing the drinking in the first place, or they haven't redesigned their lifestyle in a way that's more friendly more amenable to sobriety. In other words, if it's still hard after so much time, it's because there's still something that hasn't been fixed. Right? This thing is supposed to get easier, and it does. It has been my experience. As much as I talk about how difficult it is from time to time, it is also easier than it was. And that's compounded by the fact that sobriety doesn't solve all of your problems. In fact, in a lot of cases, it just exposes them. A lot of the problems that we experience in sobriety were problems all along. We were just drinking to conceal them, right? And you take away the drink and then suddenly you're left in a dark room with yourself, with only yourself for company. And suddenly you understand that you have to fix the problems. There is no hiding from them. Otherwise, they will get on top of you again and you'll continue to drink. And dealing with those problems and really facing them, looking them in the eye, and doing the work of sobriety is crucial at some point in your sobriety. Otherwise, it will continue to be difficult. I mean, for some people, sobriety really is genuinely easy. I started this channel because it is difficult for me. And I do have unresolved stuff that I haven't faced up to and all of that bullshit. But I started this channel because sobriety was difficult. For some people, it is easy. There's no getting around it. And that we don't talk about that enough, is that you don't hear their voices, right? You hear people like mine with very extreme alcoholism stories because we have to talk about it. But a lot of people, there is a silent minority, maybe a silent majority of people who just don't struggle. Maybe that might be you in the future. They just quit, they adjusted, and they moved on. No dramatic narrative, no constant struggle. And their stories are underrepresented because they're less compelling, you know? But they exist by the millions. So this is my ramble, this is my episode today, just talking about the difficulty of sobriety. And I just want to round it off by saying that if you're sober and it is difficult every day and you don't understand why, I hope you might understand a little bit better now that what you're fighting with is almost certainly no longer the drink itself, but some underlying problem that desperately wants you to address it because it's still trying to force you to act on it, right? And that is, take note of that. It's important that if you feel like sobriety is incredibly unusually difficult for you, then that's your psychology trying to tell you something. It wants you to fix it, and you haven't yet, and that is why it is difficult. Now, I feel like this is a lifelong battle for me. I do, as much as I have a vested interest in making my struggle compelling, because I talk about it on YouTube, there's nothing insincere here. I do think of it as a daily battle. Sobriety is a pill I will take every day for the rest of my life. And I'm okay with that. But it does really get easier. And be aware that there is a cottage industry, certainly one emerging right now, of making it seem even harder than it really is for clout, for irresponsible purposes and selfish purposes. So be wary of it and trust the way that you feel when it comes to your own sobriety. Good. If you made it this far, if you would like access to more personal Backcountry content, head over to the Patreon at patreon.com/backcountrysober. Link is in the description. Please go and try the world's best abstinent first sobriety app. That's called betterwithoutbooze.me. That's also a link in the description to that. Like and subscribe here just so YouTube is aware that this kind of content is fine, that it's okay to show people. And thank you very much for watching. And as always, good luck out there.